The truth is a heavy thing. We often think that by keeping it to ourselves, by swallowing the words that sit on the edge of our tongues, we are doing the right thing. We tell ourselves that silence is the kinder choice, the easier choice, the safer choice. But that is a lie. The weight of unspoken truth does not disappear simply because we refuse to speak it. It lingers, it festers, it carves itself into the spaces between us and the people we care about. And in the end, that weight becomes unbearable, not only for us, but for those who are left wondering why we never said what needed to be said. There are moments in life when we know, deeply, instinctively, that we should say something. A friend makes a choice that will lead them down a destructive path. A loved one is drowning in self-doubt, waiting for someone to remind them that they are seen. A child searches for validation in the eyes of a parent who refuses to give it. We see these moments and we feel that pull, that quiet whisper in the back of our minds telling us to speak, but we don't. We stay quiet, we avert our eyes, we tell ourselves it isn't our place, or that it won't make a difference, or that it will only make things worse, and so we do nothing. But the truth does not vanish just because it is left unsaid. It remains, it fills the air between us like an invisible force, pressing down, suffocating the connection that once existed. The words we do not say become barriers, separating us from the very people we claim to care about. And for them, for the ones left in the silence, it is not kindness they feel. It is abandonment. It is rejection. It is a confirmation of their worst fear that no one truly sees them. There is a kind of pain that comes from being ignored, from being left to struggle in solitude when all you needed was for someone to acknowledge your existence. And when that pain is met with silence, it deepens. It takes root. It turns into something far darker. Resentment, hopelessness, despair. A child who never hears their parents say, "I love you," will spend a lifetime questioning their worth. A person who is never reassured, never guided, never spoken to with honesty will learn to doubt their own reality. When we withhold the truth, we do not protect people, we wound them in ways they may never fully recover from. And yet we justify it. We tell ourselves that truth is dangerous, that honesty is a risk, that speaking up might push someone away, might cause conflict, might hurt their feelings. But what we fail to realize is that avoidance is not harmless. Avoidance is a slow poison. It allows problems to grow unchecked, allows wounds to deepen, allows people to slip further and further away until the distance is too great to bridge. What happens when we refuse to tell someone they are heading for disaster, when we hold back the truth because we are afraid of upsetting them? We do not spare them pain. We delay it, amplify it, ensure that when it does arrive, it will be far worse than it ever needed to be. The unspoken truth does not stay hidden forever. It finds a way out through broken relationships, through sudden explosions of anger, through the quiet realization that what could have been fixed was left to fall apart. And what happens to us, the ones who stay silent? We carry that weight. The regret of knowing we could have made a difference but chose not to. The haunting thought of what might have changed if only we had spoken. The knowledge that when they needed us most, we turned away. That is not an easy burden to bear. So what is the alternative? To speak. To tell the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it feels risky, even when we fear how it will be received. Truth is not cruelty. It is an act of care, of responsibility, of love. A difficult truth spoken at the right time can save someone from years of unnecessary suffering. A simple reassurance, an acknowledgement, a moment of honesty can be the thing that keeps someone from falling into the abyss. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of person do we want to be? Do we want to be the one who let fear control us, who let the people around us slip away because we were too afraid to speak? Or do we want to be the person who stood up, who faced the discomfort, who chose truth over silence? Because in the end, it is not our silence that will protect them. It is our willingness to speak, to care, to be there when it matters most. And if we fail to do that, if we choose silence over truth, then we must understand that the weight of what we did not say will not simply disappear. It will remain. It will haunt us. And they will feel the pain. There are moments in life when silence is not just inaction. It is a failure of character, a betrayal of responsibility, a quiet but devastating abandonment of those who need us most. We like to believe that silence is neutrality, that it is a harmless decision, that by staying out of things we are avoiding harm. But this is a dangerous illusion. Silence, when truth is needed, is not a passive choice. It is an active decision to allow suffering to continue unchecked. It is a failure of duty, a retreat into cowardice when courage is required. Every day, we are presented with moments where we could speak up, where we could intervene, where we could offer a word that might shift the course of someone's life. And yet, we hold back. We see injustice and we say nothing. We watch people make mistakes that will cost them dearly and we pretend not to notice. We witness suffering and we tell ourselves it is not our place to interfere. We become bystanders in the lives of others, allowing harm to unfold simply because we did not want to bear the discomfort of speaking. But here's the truth. Silence is not neutral. It is a choice. And it is often the wrong one. When we refuse to acknowledge someone's pain, they do not interpret it as kindness. They do not assume we are respecting their boundaries. They feel abandoned. They feel unseen, and they suffer, not only because of their struggle, but because the people around them refuse to acknowledge it. The wounds inflicted by silence are often deeper than those inflicted by words. A cruel statement can be dismissed as ignorance or impulsiveness, but the absence of acknowledgement, the refusal to speak at all, cuts in a way that lingers. It tells a person that they are not worth the effort, not worth the trouble, not worth breaking the silence for. And what of the consequences of our silence? They are never small. When we fail to stand up for what is right, wrong prevails. When we fail to warn someone of a danger we see coming, they suffer alone. When we fail to speak words of encouragement, people sink deeper into despair. The costs of silence compound over time, creating rifts in relationships, fractures in communities, and a world where people feel more disconnected and isolated than ever before. It is easy to convince ourselves that speaking is not our responsibility. It's not my problem, we say. Someone else will deal with it. But this kind of thinking is precisely what allows problems to grow into crises. It is what enables suffering to deepen and relationships to wither. If everyone assumes that speaking up is someone else's job, then no one speaks. And in that vacuum of silence, things fall apart. There's also the matter of self-respect. When we remain silent in the face of something we know is wrong, we erode our own integrity. We become smaller, weaker, more disconnected from our own values. Each moment of silence in the face of truth makes it easier to stay silent the next time, and then the next, until we no longer recognize ourselves. We become complicit in the very things we once swore we would never allow. We may tell ourselves that we are simply choosing peace, but in reality we are choosing avoidance, and avoidance is not peace. It is simply the illusion of comfort purchased at the cost of moral failure. The discomfort of speaking is real. Telling someone a hard truth, intervening in a situation that feels uncomfortable, putting ourselves at risk of rejection or conflict, these are difficult things to do, but they are necessary. Growth, healing, justice, these things do not happen in silence. They require voices, action, courage. They require people who are willing to bear the weight of honesty, even when it is difficult, even when it is met with resistance. The question we must ask ourselves is simple. When the moment comes, when our voice is needed, will we have the courage to use it, or will we choose silence and live with the knowledge that our refusal to speak allowed harm to continue? Because silence, in the end, does not protect us. It does not shield us from consequence. It only ensures that we become bystanders in a world that needed us to stand up. Neglect is not just an absence of care. It is an active force that shapes the mind, rewires emotions, and leaves scars that can last a lifetime. People often think of harm in terms of direct action, harsh words, cruel treatment, or overt abuse. But neglect, the failure to acknowledge, to speak, to be present, is just as damaging, if not more so. When someone is ignored, when their pain is dismissed, when their existence is treated as if it does not matter, it does something to them. It changes how they see themselves, how they relate to others, and how they navigate the world. The psychological toll of neglect is profound, and it does not simply fade with time. It lingers, shaping every thought, every relationship, every future interaction. At its core, neglect is a message. It tells a person you are not important, you do not matter, you are invisible. And the mind internalizes this message, sometimes without even realizing it. A child who grows up in an environment where their emotions are ignored will learn to suppress them. A friend who constantly reaches out for support but is met with silence will eventually stop reaching out. A person who is neglected in their time of need will begin to believe that their needs are a burden, that asking for help is pointless, that suffering is simply something to be endured alone. This is where the real damage occurs. Neglect doesn't just create pain in the moment, it rewires how a person thinks and feels long after the initial neglect has taken place. It fosters insecurity, self-doubt, and an overwhelming sense of unworthiness. A person who has been neglected repeatedly will start to believe that they are undeserving of love, care, and attention. They will downplay their struggles, convince themselves that they should be able to handle everything on their own, and isolate themselves rather than risk reaching out and being ignored again. And then there is the issue of trust. When someone is consistently met with neglect, their ability to trust others is damaged. They begin to expect abandonment, to assume that people will leave, to believe that no one will be there when it truly matters. This affects every relationship they have. They may push people away before they can be pushed away themselves. They may avoid vulnerability because they have learned that showing weakness leads to nothing but disappointment. They may sabotage meaningful connections, not because they want to, but because they have been conditioned to believe that no one stays, that no one cares, that no one will listen. Neglect also breeds loneliness, and not just the kind of loneliness that comes from being physically alone. There is a much deeper loneliness, the loneliness of being surrounded by people yet feeling unseen, unheard, and unimportant. This kind of loneliness is devastating. It is one thing to be alone. It is another thing entirely to be with others and still feel invisible. It creates a deep sense of alienation, a belief that one does not truly belong anywhere, that one's presence makes no real difference. This is a dangerous place to be, because when someone starts to believe that they are fundamentally disconnected from others, they lose hope. And when hope is gone, everything else begins to collapse. The consequences of neglect do not stop at emotional pain. They manifest physically too. Studies have shown that people who experience chronic neglect, whether in childhood, relationships, or friendships, are more likely to develop anxiety, depression, and even physical health problems. Stress hormones increase, sleep patterns are disrupted, the immune system weakens. The body registers neglect as a threat, as a sign that something is deeply wrong. Over time, this takes a toll, leading to exhaustion, burnout, and a pervasive sense of emptiness. And yet, despite all of this, neglect is often dismissed. Because it is not loud, because it does not leave visible wounds, it is easy to overlook. People assume that if no harm was actively inflicted, then no harm was done. But this is a mistake. The absence of care, the lack of response, the failure to acknowledge someone's presence, these things are just as damaging as any harsh word or physical blow. They strip away a person's sense of self, leaving them uncertain, disconnected, and deeply wounded in ways that are not easily seen, but are undeniably felt. So what is the answer? Attention, presence, acknowledgement. The antidote to neglect is not grand gestures or dramatic interventions. It is simply the act of seeing, hearing, and responding. It is the decision to notice when someone is struggling and to let them know that they are not alone. It is the choice to reach out, to listen, to remind others that they matter. No one thrives in isolation. No one grows in the absence of care. We are social beings, wired for connection, and when that connection is denied, we suffer, not just emotionally, but physically, mentally, and spiritually. The cost of neglect is immense, but so is the power of presence. A simple word, a moment of attention, a willingness to listen. These things can undo years of pain, rebuild trust, and restore a sense of worth. Neglect is not just an absence of action. It is a failure of responsibility. And if we truly care about the well-being of those around us, then we must understand this. Being present, being aware, and choosing to acknowledge another person is not just a kindness, it is a necessity. Avoidance is a seductive choice. It whispers promises of ease, of escape, of comfort. It tells us that if we simply look away, if we refuse to acknowledge what is in front of us, the problem will resolve itself. But avoidance is a lie. It is a costly, destructive force that does not eliminate hardship. It amplifies it. What we refuse to face today will grow in the shadows, and when it finally resurfaces, it will be far worse than if we had confronted it early on. The cost of avoidance is not just measured in time lost or opportunities missed. It is measured in suffering, in broken relationships, in the gradual erosion of our own integrity. Avoidance can take many forms. It is the parent who refuses to have difficult conversations with their child, thinking that silence will prevent conflict. It is the person who stays in a toxic relationship because leaving feels too overwhelming. It is the friend who notices a loved one struggling but convinces themselves that it is not their place to say anything. It is the individual who knows they are making unhealthy choices but refuses to acknowledge the long-term consequences. In every case, avoidance is a temporary relief that leads to greater pain in the long run. One of the most immediate consequences of avoidance is the accumulation of unresolved issues. Problems do not disappear simply because we refuse to acknowledge them. They fester, they grow. The conversation we avoid having today becomes the resentment that poisons our relationship tomorrow. The bad habit we refuse to address becomes the addiction that consumes us. The emotional wounds we bury become the traumas that define our future. Avoidance does not neutralize problems, it multiplies them. There is also the psychological burden of avoidance. When we refuse to face something that demands our attention, a part of us knows. That knowledge does not go away. It lingers beneath the surface, creating stress, anxiety, and guilt. We distract ourselves, pretending that everything is fine, but deep down, we feel the weight of what we are refusing to face. This is why avoidance is exhausting. It requires constant effort to maintain the illusion that everything is under control, when in reality, it is not. Avoidance also damages relationships. When we refuse to address conflicts, tensions do not dissipate, they solidify. Unspoken words turn into distance. Minor misunderstandings turn into irreparable fractures. A relationship built on avoidance is a fragile one because it lacks the foundation of honesty and resilience. People cannot read our minds. If we do not communicate our needs, our fears, our frustrations, then others are left guessing. And more often than not, they guess wrong. The result is unnecessary suffering, hurt feelings, misinterpretations, and a gradual drifting apart. But perhaps the most tragic cost of avoidance is the way it diminishes our own sense of self. Every time we choose avoidance over confrontation, we weaken our ability to face life's challenges. We teach ourselves that we are not strong enough, not capable enough, not worthy of standing up for what matters. This is a dangerous lesson to internalize. Life is full of hardship, and the ability to confront difficulty head-on is essential for growth, for success, for fulfillment. Avoidance strips us of that power. It turns us into passive observers of our own lives, rather than active participants. Avoidance also breeds regret. Time moves forward whether we face our challenges or not, and one day we will look back and realize the moments we let slip away, the conversations we never had, the chances we never took. Regret is a cruel teacher. It does not offer the chance to go back and change things. It only reminds us of what could have been, if only we had found the courage to act when it mattered. So what is the alternative? It is the choice to face things head on, to have the hard conversation, to acknowledge the truth even when it is painful, to take responsibility for our own lives instead of waiting for problems to magically disappear. This is not an easy path, but it is the only one that leads to real resolution, to growth, to peace. The cost of avoidance is high. It demands far more from us in the long run than courage ever will. And in the end, when we finally realize this, we will have only two choices: to face what we have spent so long avoiding, or to live with the consequences of our inaction. One choice leads to freedom, the other leads to regret. The decision is ours to make. There are moments in life when silence is not just a choice but a failure, an abdication of duty, a refusal to bear the weight of responsibility that comes with being human. Words hold power, and to withhold them when they are most needed is to allow harm to unfold in our presence. The responsibility to speak is not merely a moral obligation, it is a fundamental requirement for the preservation of truth, justice, and human connection. Yet far too often we shrink from this responsibility, convincing ourselves that it is not our place, that someone else will step forward, that silence is the safer option. But silence is never neutral. It either allows destruction to continue unchecked or deepens the suffering of those who desperately need to be heard. We live in a world where fear often dictates our willingness to speak. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of saying the wrong thing. These fears are understandable, but they are not justifications for inaction. The truth, no matter how uncomfortable, does not cease to be true simply because it is difficult to articulate. And when we choose silence over speech, we do not protect ourselves. We surrender to our own cowardice. The cost of this surrender is immense. It leaves people suffering in isolation, it allows dishonesty to fester, and it ensures that problems that could have been solved early on spiral into crises. One of the greatest tragedies of silence is its effect on those who most need to hear the truth. People who are lost, who are making mistakes, who are in pain, often do not realize the full extent of their situation. They are too close to it, too caught up in their own struggles to see clearly. And if those around them refuse to speak, if no one steps forward to offer guidance, to issue a warning, to express concern, then these people are left to stumble blindly down a path that may lead to ruin. It is a terrible thing to watch someone suffer needlessly, knowing that a few words might have changed their course. But speaking is not only necessary in moments of crisis, it is also an essential act of affirmation, of acknowledgement. How many people go through life feeling unseen, unheard, unimportant? How many suffer in silence, not because they wish to, but because no one has ever told them they matter? A simple word of encouragement, a genuine expression of care, a moment of acknowledgement, these things have the power to change a person's life. And yet, we withhold them. We assume people already know how we feel, that our words will not make a difference, that it is not our responsibility to say anything. But this assumption is wrong. Words do make a difference. A person who hears, "I believe in you," at the right moment may find the strength to keep going. A person who is told, "You are not alone," may finally begin to heal. To speak is to take a risk. It is to put ourselves in a position where we may be misunderstood, criticized, or even rejected. But the alternative, remaining silent when our voice is needed, is far worse. When we fail to speak, we contribute to the very problems we wish would disappear. We allow falsehoods to go unchallenged. We let relationships crumble because we were too afraid to be honest. We let opportunities for connection slip away because we assumed there would always be another chance. There's also the matter of self-respect. Each time we choose to remain silent in the face of something that demands our voice, we teach ourselves to be passive. We reinforce the idea that our thoughts and feelings do not matter, that our perspective is not worth sharing. Over time, this erodes our confidence, making it even harder to speak when it truly matters. The only way to break this cycle is to take the risk to step forward and speak, even when it is difficult, even when our voice shakes, even when we are afraid. We must also remember that speaking is not just about confronting wrongs or offering support. It is about shaping the world around us. Every great change, every movement toward justice, every improvement in human understanding has been driven by those who refuse to remain silent. If the people who came before us had chosen comfort over courage, silence over speech, much of what we now take for granted would never have come to be. It is not enough to admire those who spoke out in the past. We must be willing to do the same in our own time. The responsibility to speak is not always easy to bear, but it is necessary. We are not meant to be passive observers of life, watching from the sidelines as events unfold around us. We are meant to engage, to contribute, to offer our voices where they are needed most. This does not mean speaking recklessly or without thought. It means speaking with intention, with wisdom, with a deep awareness of the impact our words can have. It means understanding that while silence may feel safe in the moment, it often leads to far greater harm in the long run. So we must ask ourselves, when the time comes, when we are faced with a moment where our voice could make a difference, will we have the courage to use it? Or will we remain silent, knowing that our refusal to speak allowed suffering, falsehood, or disconnection to persist? Because in the end, the choice is ours. And while words can sometimes wound, it is often silence that does the greatest damage of all. Pain is an unavoidable part of life. No matter how carefully we plan, how much we prepare, or how desperately we try to avoid it, pain will find us. It comes in many forms: physical, emotional, psychological, and it leaves its mark in ways that are often invisible to the world but deeply felt within. Yet, as much as we fear pain, as much as we wish to escape it, there is an undeniable truth. Pain is a teacher. It strips away illusion, forces growth, and offers lessons that comfort and ease never could. The question is not whether we will experience pain, but whether we will learn from it. Pain teaches us about ourselves. When life is easy, when everything is comfortable and predictable, we rarely stop to question who we are or what we are truly capable of. But pain forces a confrontation. It pushes us to our limits, testing our resilience, our patience, our beliefs. It reveals our weaknesses and, at the same time, shows us strengths we never knew we had. A person who has never faced hardship has never truly seen themselves. It is in the struggle, in the moments when we feel like we cannot go on, but somehow do, that we come to understand what we are made of. Pain also teaches us about others. It strips away pretense, revealing who truly cares and who is only there for convenience. When everything is going well, it is easy to be surrounded by people. But when pain enters the picture, when we are at our lowest, we quickly see who stands beside us and who disappears. This is not a lesson that is always easy to accept, but it is invaluable. It helps us separate the superficial from the genuine, allowing us to invest our energy in relationships that truly matter. Beyond relationships, pain is a profound teacher of empathy. It is easy to overlook the suffering of others when we have not suffered ourselves. But once we have experienced deep pain, we begin to recognize it in others. We see it in their eyes, in their words, in the way they carry themselves. We become less quick to judge, more willing to listen, more capable of offering the kind of understanding that can only come from experience. Pain humbles us. It reminds us that no one is immune, that suffering is a universal part of the human experience. Pain also teaches us about what truly matters. When everything is going smoothly, we can become distracted by trivial things, status, appearance, the approval of others. But pain has a way of cutting through all of that. It forces us to focus on what is real, on what is lasting. A person who has faced serious illness does not waste time on meaningless arguments. Someone who has lost a loved one does not take small moments for granted. Pain reorders our priorities, stripping away the unnecessary and leaving us with a clearer understanding of what is truly important. But pain's greatest lesson may be its role in growth. We do not grow when we are comfortable. We grow when we are challenged, when we are forced to adapt, when we have no choice but to become stronger. Pain breaks us down, but it also offers us the chance to rebuild, to become wiser, more resilient, more capable than we were before. This is why so many people, when reflecting on the hardest periods of their lives, recognize that those times, as painful as they were, shaped them in ways they would never undo. That is not to say pain should be glorified or sought out. Suffering for suffering's sake is meaningless. But when pain does come, as it inevitably will, we have a choice. We can let it consume us, break us, make us bitter, or we can choose to let it teach us. We can let it refine us, strengthen us, shape us into better versions of ourselves. Pain is not the enemy. It is a harsh, unforgiving teacher, but a necessary one. It demands our attention, forces us to change, and ultimately, if we allow it, leaves us stronger than we were before. The lessons it offers are not easy, but they are among the most valuable we will ever receive. And in the end, the people who learn from pain rather than run from it are the ones who emerge not just intact, but transformed.